want to share that later on, we will be providing that recording or posting that recording on our Texas 4-H website probably within the next week or so. So just want to give everybody the heads up that we are recording this session. So Luis, I'll let you get things kicked off for us, and I'll man the chat session there.
Okay, well, just want to welcome everybody to this session, and certainly appreciate y'all being on this morning. My name is Luis Saldana, and I'm a 4-H program specialist in Weslaco in the District 12 office, and glad to be part of this morning's session along with Derrick. I'll let him introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, my name is Derrick Bruton. I'm 4-H specialist, headquartered in the Dallas Center. And so, yeah, I'm equally glad to see everybody here this morning, and looking forward to answering any questions you might have. So if you have some questions along the way, feel free to jump in on the chat room. Hopefully you found that button. If not, look down towards the bottom of your screen, and you should see a button there where you can activate that, and it'll pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll be manning that while Luis is talking, and vice versa. So feel free to stop us and ask any questions along the way.
Excellent. Well, welcome, and you know, today's session on best practice for virtual meetings was something, or is something, that probably over the last couple of months some of us may have already been vaguely familiar with. Some of us have gotten more familiar with than we probably wanted to at the same time. But nonetheless, it became a real important tool and a necessity for a lot of groups, not necessarily exclusive to 4-H, but a lot of people, students and schools and things, began to use this kind of technology to bring people together. And it's not new technology, but it, like I mentioned earlier, may have forced us to kind of use this in light of not being able to gather as groups, and that whole idea, is an evolving process. So a group of folks, began to kind of look at this and look at ways that we could use these virtual meeting spaces to gather people and take care of the things that we needed to take care of. Engage young people and engage each other in ways that may be a little bit different, or maybe a little bit, when I say uncomfortable in the sense that it's outside of our norm, where we're more, face to face in the same room. So with that, and with the use, as we started to kind of do this, one of the things we found is there were some really advantageous parts of using virtual platforms and using this method to host virtual meetings. And at the same time, there were some other things that we needed to be wary of and aware of in order to make sure, in multiple things. One, that the meetings were effective, and two, that, we engaged people the way we intended to, and three, that we were able to accomplish what we were trying to accomplish. So I'm going to get Derrick to switch over to the first slide, and I guess what we really want to focus on first, and we'll talk about maybe the purpose and goals of 4-H virtual meetings. We'll also discuss a little bit some of the safety and security of youth through this venue, and that's always been paramount for even our face-to-face meetings, as most of you, or all of you know. Some of the practical side, some of the platforms, and the technical side of these virtual meetings, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about the actual hosting the meetings and how those some practices that might be helpful to you in hosting those meetings virtually, and then we'll wrap up with a brief pointing you to some resources, and if you've got some questions, we'll certainly answer those. Derrick mentioned a minute ago, he's keeping an eye on the chat. So if you've got a question, you can certainly do that. If you're familiar with Zoom, there's the hand raising feature that you can use in there as well to grab one of our attentions right in the middle of a thought, and we'll certainly be glad to answer any questions you have. But so as we look at the purpose and goals of 4-H meetings, if you back and take the virtual part of it out, virtual part out of 4-H meetings, you think about what 4-H meetings are intended to do. They're for all practical purposes, it's a social gathering in which young people and adults get together, and if it's a 4-H club meeting, it's led by the 4-H members. If it is an adult meeting, a project meeting, a volunteer meeting, a project leader meeting, or something like that, it may be exclusively adults. And then we certainly have situations where we have both adults and youth involved in some of these meetings. So depending on the type of meeting that you're hoping to host, know that there's probably some strategies that will work in one respect, and some practices working with one kind of goal in mind, and some that may not. So just know that this is not a cookie cutter kind of approach, more is to give you some ideas on how you can do what you want to do. One of the first considerations of hosting a virtual meeting is, what is the type of interaction you're hoping to have? If we look at our group this morning, I don't have an actual, there's 46 participants, which is a good group. And if you think about in the context of that as a 4-H meeting, how big is that? More or less than your normal 4-H meeting? But is it really intended to be one-way communication? Am I really using this platform to try and convey information to other individuals with very little feedback, in return, or maybe on a very marginal level? So is it intended to be one way? Is it intended to be interactive, where there's dialogue and there's discussion back and forth? There's questions, like ideally that's kind of the idea here this morning, is that we'll be a little bit more interactive and you get to ask questions. And then, or is it collaborative? And collaborative is much more intense and much more involved in terms of work groups and maybe more vigorous discussion back and forth and idea sharing and things like that. So think about that in terms of using the platform and some of the tools that are available to you, and how those best practices might help you kind of have a successful meeting. The other thing is, once you've figured out which way, what kind of meeting you're hoping to have, is setting some goals for your meeting, and something as simple as time goals, maybe some objectives in terms of things you'd want to accomplish. Do we want to be able to get feedback on 2 or 3 items, or if it's a club meeting, do we have a business that we need to conduct? And if it's a club meeting or something like that, when we'll talk a little bit about this later, the structure for that could clearly be your agenda. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in just a little later in our presentation this morning. But, setting those goals in advance, and then certainly wouldn't help if there's a group of you hosting the meeting, that everybody be on the same page in terms of knowing what it is that you're trying to accomplish, so that you all can work that. And this is a no-brainer. I mean, we all know that. I mean, they say, you got to know where you're going before, that way when you got there. So set some goals for your meeting. Don't be too ambitious, but know that some of these platforms, I think a lot of us have realized over the last couple of months, that these platforms and these virtual meetings have probably been more effective than maybe we thought they could be. And so don't underestimate what you might be able to accomplish through some of these virtual meetings. You may have to think outside your norm a little bit to get some of these things done, and we'll talk about that a little later, but when we talk about actual hosting a meeting. But set those goals and set yourself up for being successful in terms of getting the things done that you hope to accomplish. And then as far as the club meeting experience, if we're talking about an actual 4-H club meeting, and we think about what we specialists and agents and volunteers across the state that work with clubs know that there's 4 basic parts to every 4-H club meeting, and these platforms, these virtual meetings, are very conducive to still fulfilling those 4 kind of general areas. You can see those on your screen. And so I would encourage you, as you look at hosting these meetings, is follow that same pattern that we propose that all club meetings should be. I mean, the standard, if you will, the utopian 4-H club meeting would be these 4 parts, which would include some kind of inspiration, some kind of program, meaning an educational component to the meeting, learning something, the business part of the meeting, and then some kind of recreation. One of this is just an example. One of the counties used, in terms of the recreation, they would do a virtual bingo. And so everybody had bingo cards, and then the presenter was calling them out, and they would have a 4-H little bingo, and there was a prize. So that was an interactive way that they could, engage and be in a recreational kind of activity. But use those kind of 4 areas, structure your 4-H meetings, in that kind of framework, if you will, and it'll help kind of meet those goals that we hope to meet through those club meetings. It's not a substitute. Obviously, the being in person and being able to see and hear and feel in terms of the people in the room, it's not the same, and we recognize that. But there's still some ways to get your goals done, or meet your objectives. So think about that. I mean, what type of meeting, what kind of interaction are you hoping to have? What are you trying to convey? Set some goals for yourself. And then once you set those goals, structure that virtual meeting. If it's especially if it's a 4-H meeting, club meeting with 4-H members, use that pattern of inspiration, a program, a business meeting, recreation, all kind of pulled together with an agenda. And I think you'll find that you'll be able to accomplish more than maybe you thought you could. So from here, I'm going to transition to Derrick, and he's going to talk a little bit, or for a few minutes, a little while, on safety and security, and I'll let him kind of cover that area because I think it's important. There's some issues that surfaced recently that I think many of you are familiar with, and he's going to kind of try and address some of those.
All right, yeah. So I'm going to kind of be the lawyer in the room, I guess, so to speak, to kind of talk about some of the issues that might arise. We've seen a couple of things even yesterday. They weren't really bad or anything, but they can be very disruptive during the middle of a meeting. And I hate to say it, but I mean, we had one 4-H member that was in one of the Zoom meetings yesterday, and it was just really disruptive in the chat session. And I think that just comes with a level of maturity. So you may come across some of that, and you need to figure out ways to kind of handle that. But before we get into that part, which I think Luis may touch on a little bit later with some of the decorum that we expect and etiquette within a Zoom meeting that you may want to instill in your club meeting, we really need to kind of go over some of the foundation, the groundwork behind some of that, some things you really got to think through. And so number one is this is not like any other youth meeting that we have, where we have to have youth protection standards in place. And so those all fall under our Texas 4-H rules and guidelines. So as volunteers or county extension agents, whomever we're speaking to this morning, we got to make sure that we're following those same kind of guidelines. And so specifically within a virtual environment, we got to think of it kind of in the same way as if the kids were in our presence, and face to face. And so that means no one-on-one private meetings between the adult and the kids. We need to make sure that in a lot of cases when we're having our meetings, that we have at least 2 screened and approved adult volunteers there present in that meeting. I know the smaller clubs may have some challenges with that, but it's just an ideal situation that we have more than one person there, one adult or more than one adult there in the room with the kiddos, for a number of reasons. One, simply just like today, where one of us is speaking, the other one can be moderating the chat. So that's a simple thing, but also just from a youth protection standpoint, that's what we're after in regards to this part of the discussion. So other things, we want to make sure that that the meeting stays focused on the project at hand, or if it's a club meeting, we want to try to keep it limited to that, so that we don't get off on tangents with personal discussions and those kind of things. Those are things that can occur outside of the club meeting, because the idle chitter chatter that takes place during a meeting can really be disruptive to everybody else who's listening in. So try to stay to the agenda as much as possible, and limit those little sidebar conversations. And that might be a time that you do something, schedule a little bit of time ahead of the meeting where maybe you join in 10 or so minutes ahead of time, so that if some people want to just have that kind of discussion, they can do that. In regards to personal information, during these meetings, it's ideal not to be collecting or discussing or sharing any kind of personal information. So that includes names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, banking information for the club, or banking information for persons. So, I mean, it's common sense kind of stuff, but we need to make sure that we're doing that, because, we've learned over the course of the last 2 months or so, we hear some security breaches here and there that some of these companies have, and so we don't want there to ever be the instance where some of our kids' personal information or our club's financial information or something like that is hacked by somebody unscrupulously, joining in or secretly getting into some of these meetings behind the scenes that we don't know about. And it has happened in certain circumstances. And so we just want to minimize that as much as possible. In regards to recordings, it's probably best if you just consult with your county extension office, just to see if you think that's if you both collectively think that that's warranted, and maybe there is a legitimate reason for recording. Maybe a large portion of the club members couldn't attend that meeting, and so having a recording there available for them to go back in and watch after that meeting is over might be suitable. But even then, just as soon as it's not needed, just go ahead and have it deleted. A lot of times there's two options there when you're recording. One is that the recording would reside or be downloaded onto the host's computer. So that's one option. And so you would have to figure out a way to then share that. And a lot of times those files are in the format of an MP4, which is a video file. And so you would have to figure out a way to share that with other people, that being email or some other method. So you got to think about file size when it comes to that. Probably the better solution and the other option is to allow the recording to reside in the cloud on that particular platform's website. And so then at that point, you would just be sharing a link to that recording to those individuals that you want to see that. And so just know that in advance that's some of the things to consider in regards to recordings. And then, like I said, just delete the recordings when it's no longer necessary. And most importantly, too, the recording should never replace the minutes that's being recorded by the secretary. That kind of would take away that responsibility from that individual. So make sure that the secretary is keeping good minutes and not using this as a crutch or as a replacement for keeping minutes. So with that, we're going to move on to, do we have any questions or anything at this point? I don't see any in the chat there.
No questions posted yet.
Okay. So we'll carry on to the next section here, where we're going to talk about specific platforms and features. There's a lot of platforms out there, and what I mean by platform is things like Zoom or GoToMeeting, Skype, Google Hangouts. The list goes on and on. There's a lot of different platforms out there that you can pick from, and so what you really need to do is figure out what works best. And the best way to figure that out is to figure out what people are comfortable with. Maybe some people have used Microsoft Teams and they like it, and everybody's familiar with it and has access to it. So that might be the platform that you want to go with. It may be Zoom or Adobe Connect or any of those. So poll your audience to figure out what works best, what they have the capabilities of joining in on, and also find out what the features are for those particular platforms. We need to determine accessibility. So is it something that people can use a mobile app for, or use their tablet, or do they have to be on a PC? Can they join in via phone if they don't have an internet connection? I know a lot of times during our faculty meetings, We have a lot of our colleagues that are on the road at that given time, but they can easily join in via phone and listen into the conversation, and also provide dialogue back if necessary. They may not be able to see the screens, and hopefully they're not looking at the screens while they're driving, but at least they can, plug in via Bluetooth and listen to it as they're driving down the road. So that's an option there for those who may not have internet connection or may have just spotty internet connection. That can provide a good opportunity for them. Reliability and speed is probably pretty critical if you're trying to have a really effective meeting where you're having slides that are presented or videos or those kind of things. And so you really got to think through those kind of things about what your kids have access to. If you're in rural areas who may have very, very limited internet connection, then that is something to really consider. So meeting virtually may not be the ideal situation. So you may want to move to some other format, whether it's a teleconference or just a simple chat room. With our STEM ambassadors, we use a program or a platform called Slack, and Slack is just a way for us to share files. We can also just get in a group chat and have a discussion that way. And so we do utilize that quite a bit. Some other things you got to think about is some of the setup stuff is the host needs to be the one that secures a named account within the platform provider. And with that, you can use, just so you know, you can use club funds to pay for a subscription for one of these platforms if needed, because some of them have limited time that you can use the service for free. For instance, Zoom only allows you a 40-minute time limit there if you're using their free account. So if you can get your club meeting done in less than 40 minutes and right at 40 minutes, then go for it, because it will close down the meeting right at that 40-minute mark, and it'll kick everybody out of the room. So that may not be the best option, but just know that you can use your club funds to pay for subscriptions like that. Just make sure that you run that through, the normal procedures of a club voting on those kind of things and approving those expenditures. Some other things in regard to the setup, it's a good idea to notify your county extension office of all those virtual meetings, just so that they're aware of what's going on and when it's going on. And maybe they can jump in and be a part of your meeting. It may be an easier way for them to be a part of your meeting as well, as opposed to traveling all over the county. So another thing to do is have the parents register their children in advance and provide the parents' email address to be the login for that particular meeting, and then send the meeting invitation link and the dial-in number only to those individuals who have signed up for that meeting. We get a lot of what we call Zoom bombers. I'm sure you've heard of that term in the media and such. And this is just one way to prevent a lot of that from taking place, is that only the people that sign up for the meeting are the ones that get the invitation. And so with that, we want to make sure that we're not sharing the password in any kind of public format, like on social media, on your Facebook page or something like that. You don't want to post it on the bulletin board at the extension office that here's the meeting details, here's how to log in, and by the way, here's the password. And you don't want to post it in a newsletter or anything like that, because it can easily get shared around. So that's just some real quick, simple ways to kind of keep the security a little tighter on our club meetings. And then if you can, much like you did today, enable the platform's lobby or waiting room. So you guys, before you were admitted into this room, you went to what's called a waiting room, and then we could see the names of all the individuals that were sitting in the waiting room, and then we could identify, yes, we know that individual, okay, they can come in, we can admit them into the room. And so again, it's just another way to filter out any possibility of people joining the meeting that aren't supposed to be there. And then in regards to some of the tools, there's a lot of different tools that a lot of different platforms have. So it varies from platform to platform, but a lot of them will have some kind of polling feature, which could be a way to maybe incorporate votes into your meeting if you needed to do that. You can use simple things like the raise hand feature that Luis mentioned earlier. There's also a yes and no button down at the bottom of the list of participants. So if you pull up that list of participants on your side, you can see those little buttons down at the bottom. And there's even a go slower or go faster button. I saw somebody clicked on the go faster button during one of the sessions yesterday. I don't know that the presenter saw that. So that's where it's good to have a partner there that can bring attention to those kind of things. Also, again, there's the chat room, which is a good way to also maybe do votes and just carry on some sidebar conversations if you need to. You can even do one-on-one conversations between one another. I don't know if you've seen that or not. There's a drop-down list there where it says to, and you can actually carry on that one-on-one dialogue so that everybody doesn't see your sidebar conversations there. And then obviously there's screen sharing, which is probably the best way to kind of make this a little more interactive so that you can see and follow along with either the club meeting agenda, or if you've got a speaker that's presenting, then they can share some information there via their screen. You can do you can share things like videos, but again, that goes back to that connectability and those kind of things. You start really bogging down the bandwidth whenever you start to share videos and those kind of things. So just be wary of that. And there are some special features that you've got to, or special buttons that you've got to turn on so that your audience hears the audio that you hear on your side. Just because you play a video on your end doesn't mean that they hear what you're doing. So there are some buttons that you got to click on. And so researching that kind of information ahead of time before your meeting is ideal. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over, I believe, to Luis and let him continue on with the next sections.
Thank you, Derrick. Some really important things to consider that will all play into as we talk about hosting. And this is the practical side of actually hosting your meetings. And I've got a few bullets up on the screen to kind of lead us through some of the major areas, and some we've kind of touched on briefly. We'll get into a little bit more detail here in just a second, but and maybe this is the poor choice of a phrase in terms of rules of engagement, as we think about saying, okay, what if we're going to host a meeting, what kind of rules? And you've heard Derrick talk about features and these platforms and what some of them offer and what some of them don't, and the security and things like that. So one of the important things, my wife is a classroom teacher, and elementary, and one of the first things you see when you go in the classroom is a list of rules on the wall. It's be nice to each other, and those kind of common, the golden rule kind of things. And so when we get into these virtual meetings, because this is kind of, and our club meetings are probably that way, and that families and kids kind of know already, at least the ones that are recurring members. Maybe the new ones take a little bit of time to kind of figure it out, but they understand the rules, how the meetings run, where do we sit, where do we sign in, all of those things. So establishing some kind of rules of engagement on how these meetings are going to take place, whether that be formally in writing, that's part of an email, as Derrick points out, where you send this email invitation out and saying, here's how we're going to, just to give people a heads up on how we're going to do this. Because one of the things we find is that even for new technology, and I think Derrick brought up Slack, and a couple of people commented in the chat about Slack and how neat it is, that some of us may go look at Slack to use it, but some of us may just not worry, if you will, about all of the details. We just, they sent me a link, and then 3 minutes before the meeting, they'll just click on the link, and there's all kinds of, connectivity problems, and they're clogging up the chat with saying they can't hear, and it's really not the platform's issue. It's that they didn't spend time prepping themselves, or that they were in the right place. They don't know where the mute button is. They don't know where the audio button is, or the video, or the photo, or, perfect example, going back a little bit to the security is, if somebody else, if on a PC, for example, if somebody else has used Zoom prior to you using it, or the 4-H member or family member using it, they may have logged in with a different name, and that name shows up. And so that's happened to me. It happened in a faculty meeting where my wife's name showed up instead of mine. But nonetheless, what are the rules of engagement? And then some of them may be the same, and some of them may and will probably be a little different than your face-to-face meetings. So it's important that you clearly communicate what those rules are, how the meeting will take place, any details that are specific from, if you have normally a normal face-to-face meeting, if there's a sign-in sheet, and those sign-in sheets are used to take attendance, and that attendance has implications for some kind of incentive program or something that they might need later on to verify that. How are you going to handle attendance? And yes, I was at this virtual meeting. So thinking about some of those things are going to be kind of important, how you're going to handle those. Derrick mentioned the tools within the platform, using the hand raising, or in Zoom's case with a yes and no, and all these platforms have variants of some of the same or similar features, but how are you going to handle voting? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So setting some ground rules. You might even want to discuss a few of the how-tos if needed. Where's the mute button? Where's the unmute? And as we get into etiquette, we'll talk. Muting seems to be a recurring topic. How to access the chat. Well, I don't know. I don't see the chat. We posted in the chat. Well, where is the chat? I don't even know where the chat is. So setting up those kind of preparatory components are going to be real important. Let's move into talking about muting and unmuting. Let's talk a little bit. And I think Derrick used the term decorum, which is a great word to describe the appropriate interaction, I would say, not behavior, but interaction when using this platform, and etiquette, simple etiquette. I was always accused of being, this is many years ago, being the loud cell phone talker guy. You know what I'm talking about. You're in a room full of people and you're on the cell phone and you just seem to want to talk over everybody when that's not necessary. I've gotten a lot better. But so what is the etiquette? What are some strategies or some best practices as it relates to etiquette? One is, of course, let people know what your expectations are. And one of the most important things, or one of the most valuable things you can do, and we're kind of modeling that here today, and it's a great way to get your other officers, your 4-H members, engaged in the entire meeting, much like you would at a regular meeting, is assign different 4-H members different responsibilities. So a moderator, for example, as opposed to, if the president is going to lead the meeting, some of these platforms have a feature that says mute all. And it's instead of finding out who's talking, and that creates, on some platforms, and depending on the connectivity, if somebody's shuffling paper in the background and there's somebody speaking, depending on the audio settings, everybody else may be hearing just the paper shuffling and not the person presenting. So, making sure people turn their mute off, and the intent is not to prevent them from speaking. The intent is to make sure that everyone's engaged in what's the intended part of the meeting that we need to hear. Background noises, things like that. If you'll look at my thumbnail, it's actually video. I've got my camera on, and there's a background here that's just black so that it doesn't show any there's nothing there on the back wall. But sometimes a lot of you are doing this from home or from some other alternative location. Derrick mentioned people driving. Hopefully you're not using video while you're driving, but if somebody else in the car is, there's road noise. There's all kinds of things that can interfere with the audio. Login names is another important part. Derrick kind of mentioned this, is being sure that the login names not only are identifying, who's on, but that they're appropriate. And so it may be something as simple as an email address or something like that, but just keep an eye on that. And those are really important, especially when we have young people engaged in these meetings. But more importantly, that people be clearly identifiable. If you have a code number like G43296, no one knows who that is. So that's just etiquette, so that we know who's talking, and we can identify from the thumbnail or the folks, the little thumbnails are on the screen, who's speaking. One of the things, and if you've watched the news lately, and it's been quite common, is I'm not using them today, but I do use them quite frequently, is to encourage people to use earbuds, whether they're plug-ins or Bluetooth or whatever. And what that does is, sometimes when you're having multiple people, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, if this is intended to be a collaborative meeting where lots of people are having to talk at the same time, it may be not practical to mute everybody, but earbuds will help prevent feedback. And that means somebody that's speaking's audio from your speakers is going into your mic and coming back through, and it sounds like an echo or squealing or all kinds of things like that. It may improve the quality of your audio experience for everybody if you do that. While it's not, and it should not be required, recommending this in advance is always smart. Let people know in advance so that you avoid the problems during your meeting. One of the things that you want to think about in terms of people being engaged in your meetings is that you may have multiple people participating from a single site, from a single login. You may have family members, where there may be 2 or 3 family members logging in. And while probably might be ideal, and this becomes a technical issue, while it might be ideal that everybody's sitting in the kitchen or living room or wherever, and they're all kind of engaged in one connection, it's not uncommon for people. Well, I'm going to go to my room, and you go to your room. I'm going to go to the back porch, and everybody's logged in on one connection from one home, one internet connection. That may make things, kind of difficult. So, not just for them, but maybe for the rest as well. So just know that there may be some people there are multiple people logged in at each location. In terms of visuals, the visual impact during a meeting can, include the president or the officer's video. If they want to be seen, a video is much more engaging than per se a photo or an image, but that's just a choice. It's important that the leading person be easily identified. So if you look through some of the, and I'm not, this is not a criticism of anybody that's on the group, but at bare minimum, the people that are leading the meeting should be identifiable, not just by name, but probably by, an image or a photo or something, so that there's that sense of connection to that individual. So visuals can be really important. We're using screen sharing here and using PowerPoint, which is really, really helpful. And it's not hard to take, what you want to share, whether it necessarily is a presentation, and put it in a PowerPoint presentation, because it makes it easier to kind of run through those visuals in your meeting. It may include, your financial report, so people can see and not just hear. A point of security is, don't put your bank statement up there where it has your account number and name and address, because if it's video recorded and someone, you get what I'm saying. You can put the information in a visual way so people can just see and hear at the same time. Seeing and hearing at the same time is much more valuable to the people that are engaged in the meeting. So use visuals. You can do screen sharing, which is PowerPoints. If you can do images, you can do videos. And Derrick mentioned, being sure if you're going to share a video, and if it's got audio, that it's working in a way that when you play it, they're actually seeing the video and the audio and hearing the audio as well. So, and for me, for the most important one here, in terms of structure, is the agenda. it's the single most important visual that you'll want and need your participants to be able to see. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can email it to them in advance. You can incorporate it into a PowerPoint so they can actually see it on their screen as you're going through. You may even assign a specific person that can, you know, use a markup tool and check items off the agenda as you kind of work your way through. But you know, the agenda is probably the single most important thing when it comes to your 4-H virtual meetings that you can use to kind of help people follow along where you're at. And so, you know, keep that in mind. Leading and moderating. To me, this particular bullet or topic, if you will, is where I think there's at least this one and the next one are the ones where you can engage more than just one person. Your presiding officer, your 4-H club president, is give some of those 4-H members a role that includes moderating. One can moderate the chat, one can moderate the visuals, and the secretary can be kind of monitoring and keeping up with notes, things like that. But like your face-to-face meeting, you know, your president or the presider is the lead communicator, you know, throughout the virtual meeting. And so they use the agenda to kind of lead everybody through the items and keep the flow of the meeting moving. But a single presider, you know, it may be too much for a single presider to handle, you know, all of the different facets that present themselves on a virtual platform like we're using today. So using those fellow officers as moderators and assigning them some tasks will be helpful. Find somebody that can just watch, and if there's background noise from somebody that hasn't muted their, or perhaps accidentally unmuted their mic, they can go in and either send them a text, a chat, or physically mute them on the platform itself. Keeping an eye out for raised hands. So if we've got a question at hand, or there's a discussion, somebody that can say, oh, you know, Derrick's got a question, so the presenter can stop, or the presider can stop, if you will, and they can address those. So use that as an opportunity to kind of share those responsibilities. And parliamentary procedure is pretty simple, and in fact, I would argue the platforms probably lend themselves more to following appropriate parliamentary procedure because it's difficult. It's more difficult to engage. And that's not the intent. I'm just saying you get less interruptions. You can have it, the discussion and everything happen probably a little bit more smoothly than intrusive outbursts in the meeting, or 17 people raising their hand and you don't know which one raised their hand first, and things like that. So parliamentary procedures, you know, clearly going to be something that you'll want to follow, but it's going to require you to explain how. You know, how are we going to proceed through our agenda? How are we going to use appropriate etiquette? You know, how are we going to do raising hands? Maybe the raising hands takes place in the chat. So that's how we know. That's how we know who raised their hand first, if you will. So parliamentary procedure is really important, and we'll kind of explore that a little bit more. I'm looking over at the chat. Think about the family scenario when voting. You know, how would 3 kids tuned in through one connection be able to cast individual votes? That's a great point, and that's why I brought that up in terms of knowing, you know, and not just knowing in general. You, the secretary or whoever, the club manager, the moderator, knowing, you know, I'm just looking up at my screen. I don't mean to pick on Shauna, but Shauna's name is there. And so at that login site, is that just Shauna, or is that Shauna and a brother, or Shauna and a sister, or Shauna and 2 siblings, or what? So those are really good points. And hopefully we'll try and address a little bit of that in the voting discussion here in just a second. But you should follow the same standards, okay? And the standards are the standards of any meeting in terms of parliamentary procedures. It's not an open meeting where people just talk. You know, someone raises their hand, they're recognized by the chair. Once they're recognized, then they, you know, get the opportunity to speak, whatever the item of discussion is, and then you move on, okay? And so just letting people know, saying, look, everyone's welcome to engage, but this is the process. And we're going to use, you know, the same parliamentary procedure rules we use when we have face-to-face. Remember, I mean, the parliamentary procedure is not designed to make participation more difficult. It's intended to make it more orderly, so that you don't have people speaking over each other. And with these types of settings, when multiple people are speaking, sometimes you don't hear anything. It's not that one person spoke louder than the other, but you get chopped words of both people and you can't make sense of what's going on. So follow those same ParliPro guidelines and just be patient with the attendees, knowing that this is maybe a new process. I'm looking over at the chat. If you can be prepared ahead of time, I've used JotForm or a voting link that can be shared. Good point. I'm not familiar with JotForm, Shauna, but ideally, you're right. I can just guess that it's a way for them to kind of cast their votes, and we'll talk more about voting. Voting seems to be real important as well. So let's move over into the actual business meeting, you know, presenting business, because that, you know, when you get into the educational part or the inspiration part or the recreation part, that's a little bit more fluid and dynamic, and there's a lot more flexibility in how that works. But when you get into the business, you got to, you know, like you got to say, you got to take care of business. So how do we do that? You know, of course, using your parliamentary procedure, work your way through the agenda, and remember, you know, at the very beginning, when you set your goals for your meeting, what were you hoping to accomplish? The objective is to present that business in an orderly fashion using your agenda and parliamentary procedure. So it's not a good idea to use this approach to avoid or discourage or minimize participation. To the contrary, you just should be able to engage all the participants more effectively, okay? I'm looking over at the chat. It says we had a Google form set up ahead of time that worked really well for us. We could also adjust it during the meeting relatively quickly. So that's a great suggestion, Melanie. And I think to me the most important aspect of that is you have somebody that's part of your leadership team that's responsible for that, and making those adjustments quickly is easy to do when that one person's focused on doing that and they can make those adjustments. So that's a really good suggestion, Melanie, as well. So motions and nominations, well, those work ideally like they would normally work. You know, you follow your parliamentary procedure standards. You know, you bring up an item of business. If there's a motion to be made, it's the hand that goes up. Recognition by the chair, the motion is made. The chair solicits a second if it's required. So, you know, you solicit that. You get that either by hand raising or text chatting or something like that. And then you get into, you know, the discussion part of it, and that can happen, you know, either through the chat or raising of the hands where they can unmute their mic. And I would encourage you to allow people to unmute their mics and speak. It's sometimes it's a little easier, if you will, to just talk and just let the hands and the chats kind of go on the side. But you really want to engage them. You want them to have that, you know, if you think about that face-to-face meeting, recognize that this platform is not a replacement for club meetings, but we still want to be able to have that engagement across members through their meetings. So encourage them to speak during their meetings. You know, it may be a little tricky for nominations, for example, when you have nominations for the floor, because you may have someone that nominates and someone that may or may not want to accept the nomination, or maybe they're not eligible for it because the other person doesn't know. So just recognize that's going to be a little bit trickier to handle. Use your fellow officers to assist, you know, in this regard, and restate or ask for corrections is really important. Discussion, we've talked a little bit about that. Using the hand raising tool, and in some cases, some of the platforms, when multiple people raise their hand, it will actually number the order in which they raise their hand. So you can give people a sequential kind of opportunity for them to get engaged in that based on when they were able to raise their hand. Voting is the tricky one, and we've already had several suggestions. Some of the platforms themselves have polling features. Hand raising, you can even use the hand raising as a feature. Clearly, it's a lot more difficult to do like you would in a normal meeting, where you would have a yay or a nay, just spoken. That's much more difficult to do in this platform, but it's still doable through other methods like the text chatting or the hand raising. In the case of using some of these polling features like JotForm as mentioned and Google Forms and things, is including that link. Put that link in the text chat so they can access it quickly, and you can get those things taken care of. It's going to be a little tricky in terms of, we talk about multiple people in one home. Well, then if those 3 people are there, then those 3 people, if those are 3 members, then all 3 can vote. Someone says, where is the hand raising button located? If you look on your screens, probably down at the bottom, there's a little icon that says participants, and it'll actually open a window that shows who's logged in. And at the bottom of that is you'll see a yes or a no, the go slower, go faster, and a raise hand on this platform. And Microsoft Teams has a hand raising feature as well, but I believe it's by your name in that same feature. I'm looking at the chat. Let's see, asking for responses is also a way to keep people engaged. Exactly, Derrick. Getting people to unmute their mic and engage the discussion is really, really helpful. It says, go ahead and give us a check mark if you found that. So if you found the participants icon at the bottom of your screen and you clicked on that and it opened a window, just for purposes of visualization, go ahead and click on a raise a hand, a yes or a no, or any one of those little icons so that people can see that, oh, let's see, Felicia raised her hand, and Aaron and Kalina have all raised their hand, several people, Lexi, and I'm watching Amber. So you see the buttons there, and that's a way for, now you can raise it individually and unraise it. But that can be a little tricky when you're trying to count votes specifically. These will probably be more practical from a getting feedback or getting people to interrupt your discussion. So great point. Thanks for pointing that out, Derrick. I'm glad you all found that. Just to kind of wrap it up, there are lots of ways you can do that. You mentioned the Google Forms. One of the things that we did, and interestingly enough, that the Google form, and I'm not familiar with JotForm, but it may work the same way, is that the platform itself, the voting platform, is simply just a yes or a no. And so the presider presents an item of business. Maybe they're voting on whether or not to do a community service project. So that's really simple, and you can do yes or no's. When you get into officer elections, depending, and every club and group may handle this a little bit differently, anonymity may be important to the group. A lot of people use a ballot, like a little sheet of paper, and they write the candidate's name down. And so it's going to be really important that you think about how you do that. One, to ensure, if anonymity is important, sometimes the anonymity is important just between the voter and the candidates, not necessarily the whole process. They don't want the candidate standing up in the front of the room and say, okay, everybody that likes this person, raise your hand. Everybody that likes this person, raise your hand. People may use a ballot just to avoid that kind of visual representation of the vote. So just think about that. Those are all, it is doable. You can host a meeting. You can have a good meeting, and I think you might even surprise yourself at how much you can get done. But use some of these, use all of them, make them work, make them fit your circumstance. But I know that a lot of clubs are really either at the time or maybe even behind. A lot of clubs will elect their officers in May, perhaps. Some do it in the fall, June, maybe, or maybe during the summer or August or September at the start of the new year. But know that this is certainly a way that you can address that. I'm going to turn it back over to Derrick, and he'll just highlight a couple of resources. And then if there's any more questions, I think we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, we're at the nearly at the hour, so we're also nearly at the end of the slideshow. So yeah, we've created a document that just we released a couple of weeks ago, I guess it was, and it's titled Best Practices and Considerations for Virtual Meetings. And so we use the content of that document for today's presentation. So you can find that on the Texas 4-H website under the Management tab there, and just scroll down to the section that's called Management Resources, and you'll see that that document is there for you. So if you want to, print it out and share it with your club officers and kind of review those kind of processes over the summer, so that if we do have to continue on with virtual meetings, then everybody's prepared and ready to go. So it's there as a resource. We're here as a resource. So if you need to get in touch with one of us, you can reach out to us via email or phone call, and we'll be happy to walk you through any processes that you need. So as a courtesy for the next presenter that starts at 9 o'clock in about 4 minutes, we're going to wrap it up today. Be sure and sign into the session. I believe Callie and them have left some links there, and also links to the other Zoom meeting. There's 2 different rooms going on simultaneously, so if you need to jump in the other one, then I believe that's what that link is, or a link that we can share if you didn't get that through your emails. So again, thank everybody for your time this morning, and again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Have a great day.
Thank you all so much, Derrick and Luis. We really appreciate that. Was a great discussion we had there. Anyone who needs to join the other room, please go ahead and do so. You should have the link to that. Those who are sticking around for the next session, give us 1 second. I'm going to put you back in the waiting room while we get the speakers set up, and then I will let you back in. And don't forget to click on the survey link. Luis just posted it again. Thanks for doing that. And register or sign up to be in the drawing for a door prize.